Hollow Pine was one of those places that never made it onto maps. A town swallowed by time, hidden deep in a forest that even GPS signals struggled to penetrate. The few who lived there clung to traditions older than anyone cared to remember. No one moved to Hollow Pine. You were either born there, or you stumbled upon it and never left. Emily was one of the unlucky ones. Fresh out of college and desperate for a job, she accepted a teaching position in the town's one-room schoolhouse. The pay was abysmal. The commute non-existent since the school was a 5-minute walk from her rented cabin. And the townsfolk, well, they weren't exactly welcoming. Her first day in town, she'd waved at an elderly man sitting on a porch, only for him to stare at her as if she'd grown a second head. At the general store, the cashier handed her change without meeting her eyes. Even the children at school were oddly reserved, their eyes darting toward the forest whenever she asked them questions about their families or hobbies. The forest was the only thing that seemed alive in Hollow Pine. Its trees loomed tall and dark, their branches twisting together like conspirators sharing secrets. Their gnarled roots clawed through the earth like skeletal fingers, and the air beneath their canopy felt thick and heavy, as though the forest itself was breathing. At night, Emily swore she could hear whispers outside her cabin, soft, sibilant murmurs carried on the wind. Sometimes she thought she could make out her name. Just the wind, she told herself. But deep down, she didn't believe it. "You shouldn't be out here after dark," said a voice behind her one evening as she locked up the schoolhouse. Emily turned to find one of her students, a boy named Ethan, standing at the edge of the clearing. His face was ghostly pale, his eyes wide and filled with something she couldn't quite place. Fear, yes, but also a deep, gnawing sorrow. "I'm just heading home," Emily replied, forcing a smile. "It's only a short walk." Ethan took a step closer, his small body trembling as he glanced nervously at the forest. "They don't like it when people are out after dark." "Who doesn't like it?" Emily asked, crouching to meet his gaze. Ethan's lips trembled, and for a moment, she thought he might cry. "The Watchers," he whispered, barely audible. "They watch, and they wait." Before she could press him further, a woman appeared, her face tight with anger. "Ethan, I told you not to bother Miss Carter." The boy's mother grabbed his arm and dragged him away, throwing Emily an apologetic but wary glance. "Sorry, ma'am. He's got an overactive imagination." Emily watched them disappear down the path, unease coiling in her stomach. That night, the whispers outside her cabin seemed louder, closer, and when she looked out the window, she thought she saw shapes moving between the trees. Tall, impossibly thin shapes that melted into the shadows when she blinked. A week later, Emily discovered strange symbols carved into the trees near her cabin. They were crude but deliberate, a series of spirals and jagged lines that seemed to pulse with a strange energy. The bark around them looked scorched, as though seared by something far hotter than fire. She felt an unshakable sense of dread whenever she looked at them, as if the symbols were watching her. She asked one of her students about them during recess. "They keep the Watchers away," said Sarah, a shy girl who rarely spoke. Her voice was barely a whisper, her eyes darting to the forest edge as though she expected something to emerge at any moment. "Who are the Watchers?" Emily asked, keeping her tone light. Sarah's face went pale, her freckles standing out, starkly against her skin. "We're not supposed to talk about them," she said, her voice quivering. "If you talk about them, they hear you." Emily's frustration grew. Every time she tried to learn more, the townsfolk clammed up. It was as if they were all in on some dark secret. One she wasn't allowed to know. The night it happened, Emily had stayed late, grading papers. She lost track of time, and by the time she left the schoolhouse, the sun had dipped below the horizon. The forest seemed to press in on her as she hurried down the path. The faint sound of her footsteps swallowed by the oppressive silence. Then she heard it, a rustling in the bushes, followed by a low, guttural growl. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. Slowly, she turned toward the sound. Eyes. Dozens of them, glowing faintly in the darkness. They were too high off the ground to belong to any animal she could name. The shapes behind them were indistinct, shifting shadows that seemed to ripple like smoke, their edges flickering as though they were struggling to hold their form. Emily did the only thing she could think of. She ran. The path blurred beneath her feet as the growls grew louder, closer. She could feel their presence pressing against her back, their cold breath brushing her neck. She didn't stop until she slammed her cabin door shut and locked it, her chest heaving with ragged breaths. The whispers that night were louder than ever, accompanied by soft scratching at her windows. She didn't dare look outside. The next day, Emily confronted the town's mayor, an elderly woman named Agnes, who seemed to know more than she let on. "What's going on here?" Emily demanded. "What are the Watchers?" Agnes sighed, her shoulders sagging. "They've always been here," she said. "Long before the town was founded. They're the forest's guardians, or its curse, depending on how you look at it. Why don't you warn people?" "Would you have believed us?" Agnes countered. "We survive by following the rules. Stay inside after dark. Don't enter the deep woods. And never, ever acknowledge them." Emily's skin prickled. "Acknowledge them?" Agnes's expression turned grim. "Once you see them, they see you, and they don't forget." The next few weeks were a blur of paranoia and sleepless nights. Emily couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, even in broad daylight. The symbols around her cabin began to fade, the bark of the trees peeling away, as if something or someone was trying to erase them. One night, she awoke to find her front door ajar. Her heart thundered as she crept toward it, clutching a flashlight. The beam illuminated muddy footprints leading from the door to her bedroom. They weren't human. Desperate, she decided to leave Hollow Pine. She packed her belongings and drove toward the highway, but the forest seemed endless, the road looping back on itself no matter which direction she took. It was as if the town wouldn't let her go. Agnes visited her the next morning, her face lined with worry. "You've been marked," she said. "The Watchers won't stop until they have you." "What do they want?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. Agnes hesitated. "A sacrifice." Emily's blood ran cold. What kind of sacrifice? But Agnes wouldn't answer. Instead, she handed Emily a piece of paper covered in strange symbols. "Place this around your cabin. It'll buy you some time." As the nights grew darker and the whispers more insistent, Emily realized she couldn't keep running. The Watchers wanted something, and until she gave it to them, she'd never be free. She returned to Agnes, demanding answers. The old woman finally relented, explaining the town's grim pact with the Watchers. Every generation, a newcomer was chosen as their offering, a way to appease the forest and ensure the town's survival. Emily was furious. "You knew this would happen. You brought me here on purpose." Agnes didn't deny it. "It's the only way." Chapter 9. The Final Night. On her final night in Hollow Pine, Emily prepared herself. She painted the symbols Agnes had given her on her skin, lit candles around her cabin, and waited. The whispers grew louder, the shadows outside her window coalescing into forms that defied logic. The watchers had come. When they entered, the candles flickered out. Emily stood her ground, clutching a knife she'd taken from the kitchen. "What do you want?" she demanded. The largest of the shadows stepped forward, its glowing eyes locking onto hers. In a voice like rustling leaves, it spoke. "You